Welcome to Story 3 in our series from Exodus. Here's a person lots of you might know. Now let's imagine for a second that none of us know who he is. How will we know who he is? Maybe we ask him about his name and he says, "My name is Superman." Okay, that's a good start. His name tells us something about him. First of all, it says his name is Superman, so his name tells us he's a man. Secondly, his name tells us that he is super. But what does it mean for him to be super? Is he just good at his homework? What if we ask him, how do we know he is super? He might say, "Watch what I can do." And then we watch and we see him fly and lift heavy objects and save people, and we can say we know Superman. In a similar way, we find out who God is today. Before we start, one thing you need to know is about names. In the Bible, names are important. For instance, the name Abraham means father of many. The name Jesus means God saves. The name Esau means hairy. Names in the Bible can tell us a lot about a person. Now, let's remember where we are up to in the story of Exodus. Moses had to run away from Egypt. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the Israelites cried out to God for help. God heard them. God would help them. But how? The Israelites haven't seen God for ages, and since we have last heard about Moses, 40 years have passed by. We are still waiting for God to help his people. But one day, this changed. I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. God spoke to Moses. God spoke directly to Moses from a bush that was on fire but didn't burn up. This is all very surprising. But what did God have to say to Moses? Why did God want to tell him something? God spoke to Moses again. I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 to 8. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Amazing. God came to tell Moses that he cares for his people. He has been listening to them and thinks now is the time to take action. This is very, very good news. But Moses is in for another surprise. Listen to what God says to him next. This is Exodus chapter 3, verse 10. "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Wow. What a job that is. God tells Moses to go back to Egypt, to go and see Pharaoh, and then lead the Israelites away. That sounds like a very hard job. And Moses knows it's a very hard job. He starts to make excuses. This is Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?'" Moses thinks he's not very important. He doesn't think he can do what God is asking him. But God promises to be with him, and that's what matters. But Moses still doesn't think he can do it. He makes another excuse. This is Exodus chapter 3, verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" These questions might sound strange to us, but remember, in the Bible, names have meanings. If you know someone's name, then you know what they are like and what they can do. So really, Moses is asking, how will the people know who you are? And how will the people know what you are going to do? God answers Moses and tells him his name. This is what God says. This is chapter 3, verse 14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." God's name is I am, or I am who I am. That is a very strange name. Or we could say it like this: I will be who I will be. It sounds very odd, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like any name we've heard before. But then we know that God is different from everyone else. So what does the name, I will be who I will be, mean? There are two things we can say. First, God's name tells us that he is eternal. He will go on and on and on. There is no end or beginning to God. He has always been and will always be. Second, God's name tells us that he is not like anything or anyone else. I will be who I will be. He is so big and powerful and mighty that he will be whoever he is. This means that the only way of seeing what God is like is by seeing what he does. So what will God do? What is God like? Well, God has told Moses what he will do. God said to Moses that he has come down to rescue his people. We will understand God's name as we see what he does. We will get to know God better as we read about him rescuing his people from Egypt. God's name is I will be who I will be, and he says he will be someone who cares for and rescues his people. How great is it that this God has shown himself? Soon we will see exactly who God is, but for now, let's be excited that this is our God and we can know him. In the Hebrew language, I will be who I will be sounds like Yahweh. So, from now on, when we look at Exodus, we won't call God by his title, God. We will call him by his name, Yahweh. Now Yahweh has told Moses his name. Moses knows Yahweh better. At the beginning, we heard what Superman's name was, and so we were able to know him better by finding out what his name was and by watching what he could do. Now we have heard what Yahweh's name is, and so we know him better too. Yahweh shows us who he is. Yahweh's name tells us that he is eternal. He is not like anything or anyone else. As we watch what Yahweh does, we will find out what it means for him to be called, I will be who I will be. As we carry on hearing stories from Exodus, we will be getting to know Yahweh more and more. The stories will show us more and more what Yahweh is like. Yahweh didn't have to tell us what he is like, but he wants us to know him. Yahweh wants us to know what he is like. Let's praise Yahweh now, that we can know him and that he tells us and shows us what he is like. We'll learn more about this God in our next story from Exodus. See you then.